Have you ever been alone with someone you secretly like, and suddenly everything feels different? That moment when their hand lingers near yours, their voice softens, and you wonder if you're imagining it, or if they're crossing a line you've only dreamed about. That's what happened when my boss asked me to stay late that Friday. I'd hidden my attraction, maintaining professionalism while noticing how his rolled-up sleeves revealed his forearms, how his eyes crinkled approvingly. Alone, I felt the rules shift, torn between desire and duty, questioning if I was ready for what might come next. The email hit my inbox at 4:52 p.m. on a Friday, marked urgent in all caps. My boss needed help finalizing a client presentation for Monday morning. I was the lead designer on this project, so it made sense. His tone in the message was all business, just like always. But the way he'd written, "I need your help," stuck with me. Not, "I need a designer," or, "Can someone stay late?" Just me specifically. When I got to his office, small things felt off. His door was slightly more open than usual, like he wanted to appear transparent. He stood up when I entered, instead of staying seated behind his desk like he normally would. "Thanks for staying," he said, adjusting his glasses. "I know it's late." He mentioned how valuable my work had been lately, how he'd been noticing my dedication. The compliment wasn't unusual, but the way he said it made my skin prickle, warmer than professional praise should feel. As we worked, I kept catching him looking at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention. Each time I'd glance up, his eyes would dart back to his screen. The office emptied out around us. The cleaning staff came by with their carts, then left. Soon, it was just the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional tap of keyboards between us. He broke the silence first. "We could order in," he suggested, hesitating before adding, "if you're comfortable. I know it's late." He adjusted his glasses again, avoiding eye contact. "Only if you're okay with it. I don't want to overstep." The way he said it made it hard to say no, framed like he was being considerate, when really he was making sure I'd stay. I told myself it was just efficiency. We'd done this before with other late nights. When the food arrived, he moved our work to the small conference table instead of his desk. He sat closer than necessary, our elbows nearly brushing as we ate. I noticed he'd chosen a place without armrests between the chairs. Small thing, maybe meaningless, but I couldn't shake the feeling he'd thought this through. The presentation notes sat mostly untouched between us. He kept steering the conversation away from work, asking about my weekend plans, and if I liked the new coffee place down the street. Normal small talk, except his knee kept brushing against mine under the table. Each touch could have been accidental. Together, they felt intentional. At one point, he reached across to point something out on my laptop, his forearm pressing against mine for just a second too long. When I pulled back slightly, he didn't acknowledge it, just kept talking like nothing had happened. That's when I realized he'd waited until everyone left before suggesting dinner. The office was empty now. No witnesses, just us and the dimmed overhead lights. He refilled my water without asking, his fingers brushing mine as he handed the glass back. "You've got great attention to detail," he said, smiling. "I've noticed that about you." The way he said it made it sound like he'd noticed more than just my work. My chest tightened. This wasn't about the presentation anymore. The later it got, the more the professional veneer cracked. He started asking questions that crossed lines. If I found older men attractive, what my type was. He framed it as getting to know his team better, but his tone made it clear this wasn't about team building. When I gave vague answers, he'd smile and say, "You're so mysterious," drawing out the words in a way that made my stomach twist. I rationalized his behavior, telling myself it was just his way of being friendly, but the signs were hard to ignore. His body language was telling a different story. The way he leaned in, the lingering touches, the way his eyes followed me, it all added up to something more than just a late-night work session. I felt a knot in my stomach, a growing unease that I couldn't shake off. The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken tension. As the night wore on, I became more aware of the subtle shifts in his demeanor. His questions became more personal, his compliments more loaded. I tried to steer the conversation back to work, but he kept veering off course, drawing me into his orbit with a mix of charm and insistence. It was a delicate dance, one that left me feeling off balance and unsure of my footing. In the quiet of the office, with only the soft glow of the computer screens and the distant hum of the city outside, I realized I was in a situation that was rapidly spiraling out of my control. The lines between professional and personal had blurred, and I was left navigating a landscape that felt both familiar and foreign. The realization hit me with a cold clarity. I needed to find a way to extricate myself from this situation, to reclaim the boundaries that had been so subtly and skillfully eroded. The bourbon appeared suddenly, like he'd been waiting for the right moment. He pulled 2 glasses from his desk drawer, along with a bottle of amber liquid. For the creative process, he joked, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Alcohol wasn't completely forbidden at work. We'd had champagne at office celebrations, but this felt different, more calculated. The way he'd kept it hidden until now made my stomach tighten. He poured just half a glass for each of us. "For nerves," he said, but his hand shook slightly as he passed mine over. When I hesitated, he nudged it closer. "Just one won't hurt." Our fingers brushed, and he froze. "Sorry," he muttered, pulling away too quickly. The air between us changed, not threatening, but charged with something unspoken. I took a small sip, the burn in my throat matching the heat in my cheeks. His questions grew more personal under the guise of team bonding. "So," he said, leaning forward, "what's your dating life like these days?" He framed it casually, like we were friends catching up. When I gave a vague answer, he pressed further. "No one special. I find that hard to believe." His knee bumped mine under the table. He didn't move it away immediately. My mind raced, alarm bells ringing. This was crossing a line, and I felt the tension solidify, like the slow pour of bourbon into the glass. The presentation slides sat forgotten between us as the conversation drifted. He kept finding excuses to touch, adjusting my papers, pointing at my screen, brushing non-existent lint off my shoulder. Each contact lasted just a second too long. When I shifted away slightly, he pretended not to notice, but his jaw tightened. At one point, he paused mid-sentence about the project. "Do you ever feel like we're playing roles here?" he asked quietly. "Like we're both hiding something?" The question hung between us. I didn't know how to respond. My pulse pounded in my ears as he studied my face, waiting. The moment stretched until he finally broke the silence. "What if we're not just co-workers?" he whispered. His voice was so low I almost didn't catch it. "What if we're 2 people who can't stop thinking about each other?" The admission shocked me. He'd put words to the tension I'd been feeling for months but couldn't acknowledge. I stared at my half-finished drink, the ice cubes melting into watery bourbon. My mind raced. This was my boss. The power dynamic alone made this dangerous. But when I risked a glance up, the look in his eyes wasn't predatory. It was vulnerable, almost scared, like he'd thrown a grenade between us and wasn't sure if it would explode. He reached across the table slowly, giving me time to pull away. When I didn't, his fingertips grazed the back of my hand. "We make such a good team," he murmured, "in so many ways." He held my gaze a second too long, and that's when I knew. This wasn't about work anymore. The realization hit me like cold water. All those late nights, the compliments, the lingering touches. He'd been testing boundaries, seeing how far I'd let him go. He stood up abruptly, stretching his arms overhead. "Been sitting too long," he muttered, rolling his shoulders. Then he walked behind my chair before I could react. When his hands landed on my shoulders, I froze. At first, the pressure felt professional, firm, kneading at the knots from hours hunched over my laptop. Something a coworker might do platonically. But then his thumbs began making slow circles near the base of my neck. His fingertips brushed the collar of my shirt. His breath warmed my ear as he asked, "Does that feel good?" The question hung between us, loaded. I didn't know how to answer. My mind raced. Was I imagining the intimacy in his touch? Maybe this was just his way of being friendly. But the way his fingers lingered at my pulse point made my stomach tighten. When I stiffened slightly, he backed off immediately, with an easy laugh. "Just trying to help you relax," he said, returning to his seat across from me. Casual, like it meant nothing, but his eyes never left mine as he took a slow sip of his drink, the ice clinking loudly in the sudden quiet of the room. The air between us felt charged, thick with something unspoken. He set his glass down carefully, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "This is a bad idea," he said abruptly, but he didn't move away. Instead, he hesitated, then added, "But if you wanted to grab coffee outside the office sometime, as friends." The word friends landed awkwardly between us, a flimsy cover for what we both knew he meant. My pulse hammered in my throat. I nodded before I could overthink it. "Just coffee," I said, though my voice sounded steadier than I felt. As the space between professionalism and desire narrowed, the office walls seemed to press closer, the space between us shrinking even though neither of us had moved. He exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath. For a long moment, we just looked at each other, the hum of the overhead lights the only sound. Then he stood again, pacing a few steps toward the window before turning back. "I should probably head out," he said, but made no move to gather his things. Instead, he lingered by my chair, close enough that I could smell his cologne, something woodsy and faintly citrus. "Tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to me. "We'll talk tomorrow." But the way he said it made it clear he didn't mean about work. I busied myself with shutting down my laptop, my fingers fumbling over the keys. When I looked up, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite place. Part hesitation, part something hotter that made my face warm. "You're overthinking this," he murmured. He reached out, tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. The contact lasted less than a second, but it sent a jolt through me. I stood abruptly, needing space. My chair scraped loudly against the floor. He didn't move, just watched me with that same unreadable look. "I should go," I said, grabbing my bag. But when I turned toward the door, he moved faster than I expected. One moment he was sitting across from me, the next he was between me and the door. He didn't touch me, but his body blocked the exit. He held up his hands in mock surrender. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," he said. But he didn't step aside. The space between us felt charged, the air thick with something unspoken. The office was too quiet now, just the hum of the refrigerator in the break room down the hall. He kept his voice low, almost intimate. I just think we have a special connection. His eyes searched mine. Don't you feel it too? The question hung between us. I could smell his cologne, something warm and faintly spicy, mixed with the sharpness of bourbon on his breath. I tried to move past him, but as I stepped to the side, his hand caught my wrist. Just for a second. But in that brief contact, I could feel his pulse racing against mine. His skin was warm, slightly damp. He let go immediately, but the touch lingered like a brand. My stomach twisted. This was crossing a line we couldn't uncross. He stepped closer then, hesitating. Can I? He didn't finish the question. His gaze dropped to my mouth. My heart hammered so loud, I was sure he could hear it. Without thinking, I tilted my chin up. His kiss was soft, questioning, not a demand, just the barest brush of lips against mine. We pulled apart instantly. His breath came faster now. We shouldn't, he said, voice rough. But I've wanted this for so long. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting sharp shadows that made his expression hard to read. Was that guilt? Desire? Both? I froze, my mind racing. This was my boss. This was wrong on so many levels. But his lips had been gentle, nothing like the aggression I'd feared. That scared me more. If he'd forced himself on me, it would have been simple. I could have pushed him away, reported him, quit. But this was mutual, complicated. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair. Guilt flashed across his face. I'm sorry. That was unprofessional. I shouldn't have. Don't apologize. My voice came out steadier than I felt. The words surprised me as much as they surprised him. I've wanted this too. His eyes widened. You have? The vulnerability in his voice undid me. This wasn't the confident leader I knew from meetings and performance reviews. This was a man trembling with fear of rejection. His usual polish was gone, replaced by something raw and real. The silence stretched between us. I could hear the faint tick of the clock on his desk, the distant honk of a car horn outside. Normal sounds that made this moment feel even more surreal. My fingers twitched at my sides. Part of me wanted to reach for him. The other part screamed to run. He exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath. I've been fighting this for months, he admitted, telling myself it was just admiration, that it would pass. His gaze dropped to my mouth again. But every time you walk into a room, I can't look away. The confession sent a shiver down my spine. I'd noticed his attention, of course, the lingering glances, the way he always seemed to find reasons to stop by my desk. But hearing him say it out loud made it real in a way I couldn't ignore. I swallowed hard. This is dangerous. I know. He didn't deny it, but I can't pretend anymore. The air between us crackled with tension. Every inch of my skin felt hyper-aware. When he reached for me this time, I didn't pull away. His fingers brushed my cheek, feather light. Tell me to stop, he murmured. I should have. Everything in my brain screamed that I should, but my body betrayed me, leaning into his touch. His breath hitched, then his mouth was on mine again, firmer this time. His hand slid into my hair, careful, but insistent. The kiss deepened, and for a moment, I forgot where we were, who we were. The only things that existed were his lips on mine, the heat of his body pressing me back against the edge of his desk. the faint taste of bourbon, the way his fingers trembled against my skin. Then reality crashed back in. I broke the kiss, panting. His eyes were dark, pupils blown wide. We stared at each other, both realizing what we'd just done. The office suddenly felt too small, the walls closing in. I needed air, space to think. "I should go," I said, my voice unsteady. This time, he didn't stop me. He stepped aside, running a hand over his face. "Yeah, okay." But as I moved past him, his fingers caught mine, just for a second. "This isn't just, it's not just physical for me." The words came out rushed, like he needed me to understand. I nodded, not trusting my voice. My whole body thrummed with adrenaline and something else I couldn't name. The walk to the elevator felt endless. My lips still tingled. My hands shook as I pressed the button. When the doors slid open, I glanced back. He stood in his office doorway, watching me. Neither of us waved. The ride down was a blur. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked foreign, flushed cheeks, swollen lips. I pressed a hand to my chest, willing my heartbeat to slow. The weekend passed in a blur of second-guessing and replaying moments. I lay awake at night staring at my ceiling, dissecting every touch, every word. Had I misinterpreted his actions? Had I somehow led him on? My stomach churned with equal parts guilt and anticipation. By Sunday evening, I'd convinced myself it had been a mistake we'd both pretend never happened. Monday morning arrived with all the awkwardness I'd feared. He acted completely professional, maybe too professional. In the team meeting, he addressed me the same way he did everyone else, his tone carefully neutral. But I caught him staring when he thought no one was looking. His gaze lingered a second too long when I presented my slides, his fingers tapping restlessly against his coffee cup. The tension between us was invisible to everyone else, but it hummed beneath every interaction. At lunch, I returned to my desk to find a folded note tucked under my keyboard. My hands shook slightly as I opened it. "Can we talk?" It read in his familiar handwriting. Somewhere neutral, no titles, just us. The simplicity of it made my throat tight. I glanced around the empty office before texting him the address of a cafe across town. 7 p.m., I added, then immediately regretted how eager it sounded. The cafe was one of those quiet places with mismatched furniture and the constant hiss of an espresso machine. I arrived early, choosing a corner table where we wouldn't be easily seen. He walked in right at 7, dressed more casually than I'd ever seen him, dark jeans and a sweater, instead of his usual button-down. It made him look younger, more approachable. He slid into the chair across from me, his knee brushing mine under the small table. Neither of us moved away. We ordered coffee we didn't really want, the barista oblivious to the charged silence between us. He stirred his drink absently, the spoon clinking against the ceramic. The air felt thick with everything we weren't saying. Outside, rain began pattering against the window, blurring the streetlights into golden streaks. "This is dangerous," he said finally, voicing what we both knew. His fingers tightened around his cup. "If anyone found out..." He didn't need to finish the sentence. The consequences hung between us, his reputation, my job, the gossip that would spread through the office like wildfire. "I know." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "But I can't pretend this isn't happening anymore." The admission surprised me as much as it seemed to surprise him. His head snapped up, eyes searching mine. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. The cafe noises faded into background static, the grind of coffee beans, the murmur of other conversations. His hand lay palm up on the table between us, an unspoken question. When I didn't pull away, he laced his fingers with mine, his thumb brushing slow circles against my skin. The contact sent a jolt through me, equal parts comfort and thrill. "We take this slow," he said quietly. His voice had that rough edge I'd come to recognize, the one he used when he was trying to keep control. No pressure, no expectations, just honesty. The last word came out almost pleading, like he needed me to understand this wasn't some casual fling to him. I nodded, my throat suddenly tight. His hand felt warm and solid around mine, anchoring me in the midst of all the uncertainty. We sat like that for who knows how long, the rain still tapping against the window, our coffees growing cold. Every so often, his thumb would pause its motion, like he was reminding himself this was real. Eventually, he sighed and checked his watch. "I should go," he said, but made no move to release my hand. "Separately, in case." He trailed off, but I understood. Office politics meant we couldn't be seen leaving together, not even here, miles from work. "Yeah." I reluctantly pulled my hand back, immediately missing the warmth. He stood, hesitating for a moment before leaning down. For one heart-stopping second, I thought he might kiss me right there in the cafe. Instead, his lips brushed my ear as he whispered, "Tomorrow," like a promise. Then he was gone, the bell above the door jingling softly behind him. I stayed at the table long after he left, tracing the rim of my cup with one finger. The reality of what we'd just agreed to settled over me like a weight. This wasn't some office crush anymore. It was real, with real stakes. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from him. "Forgot to say, you looked beautiful today." Simple, sweet, dangerous. The walk home felt surreal, the rain cooling my flushed cheeks. Cars splashed through puddles, their headlights cutting through the gloom. My phone buzzed again. "Thinking about you already?" I bit my lip to hide a smile, then immediately scolded myself. This was my boss. This was reckless. But when my phone buzzed a third time, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow," I didn't bother fighting the warmth that spread through my chest. That night, I lay awake again, but for different reasons. The memory of his hand in mine played on a loop in my mind. The way his voice had cracked when he asked for honesty. The unspoken promise in that single word, "tomorrow." It felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, equal parts terrified and exhilarated. The office became a carefully choreographed performance. We maintained perfect professionalism, no lingering touches, no meaningful glances during meetings. He addressed me with the same polite detachment he used with everyone else. But beneath the surface, everything had changed. Every good morning in the hallway felt like a secret handshake. Late-night texts became our lifeline. "Thinking of you," sent at 11:03 p.m. "Your presentation today was incredible," with a heart emoji hidden between professional praise. "Wish you were here," when he traveled for conferences. My phone became both a treasure chest and a liability, something I guarded obsessively. I memorized the pattern of his typing bubbles. 3 dots appearing, disappearing, then reappearing, before a message landed like a grenade in my lap. We returned to the cafe every Thursday, always arriving separately, always choosing the back corner table. Those stolen hours felt suspended outside reality. He'd shed his work persona like a coat, laughing louder than he ever did at the office, arguing passionately about books I never knew he read. I learned he hated cilantro, that he'd played college soccer, that his parents' divorce still kept him up at night. Each revelation felt like unwrapping a gift. The daily reality, however, was a tightrope walk. One Tuesday, I was refilling my water bottle in the break room, the only sounds the hum of the refrigerator and the distant clatter of keyboards. He walked in, heading for the coffee machine. For a moment, we were the only two people there, the air suddenly thick. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes held a spark that wasn't. "Morning," I managed, my hand tightening on my bottle. He reached past me for the sugar, his arm brushing mine. A jolt went through me, electric and terrifying. I pulled back instinctively. He didn't acknowledge it, stirring his coffee with intense focus, but I saw the slight tightening around his jaw. The moment stretched, filled with everything unsaid, before the door swung open and Janice from accounting walked in, oblivious. He gave a clipped nod and left, leaving me feeling breathless, the near miss echoing louder than any spoken word. One Thursday, as we lingered over cooling coffees, a voice cut through our bubble. "Grabbing coffee with the boss?" Our co-worker Sarah stood by our table, grinning. My stomach dropped. He recovered first, chuckling as he gestured to the spread of project notes between us. "Just going over the Henderson account," he said smoothly. Sarah nodded, but her eyes flicked between us with knowing amusement. "Right," she drawled. "Well, don't work too hard." The moment she left, the air changed. His knuckles whitened around his cup. "That was close," he muttered. I forced a laugh, but panic buzzed under my skin. We left separately that night, the usual warmth replaced by tension. My phone stayed ominously silent until 1:17 a.m., when a single message appeared. "We need to talk." I was still staring at those words when my doorbell rang at 2:03 a.m. Through the peephole, I saw him standing on my doorstep, rain dripping from his hair. He hadn't even texted he was coming. When I opened the door, he stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, water pooling at his feet. "I hate hiding," he said, voice raw. His eyes were bloodshot, like he hadn't slept. "But I'm not ready to lose you." The confession hung between us in my dimly lit entryway. I could smell the rain on his jacket, see the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. This wasn't the composed boss or even the affectionate cafe companion. This was someone stripped bare. I reached for him without thinking, my fingers brushing his damp sleeve. "You won't," I whispered. He exhaled sharply, like he'd been holding his breath for hours. Then his arms were around me, his face buried in my hair. We stood like that for a long moment, the only sound the rain against my windows and our mingled breathing. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine. "This is insane," he murmured. "We could both lose everything." I knew he was right. The rational part of my brain screamed warnings about HR policies, power imbalances, office gossip. But the way he looked at me, like I was something precious and irreplaceable, made the risk feel worth it. "I know," I said, stepping closer, "but here we are." He kissed me then, not like the tentative office kiss or the careful cafe goodbyes. This was desperate and hungry, his hands gripping my waist like he was afraid I might vanish. When we broke apart, breathless, he rested his forehead against mine. "What are we doing?" he asked, but it wasn't really a question. We didn't come up with answers that night. Just sat on my couch, his arms around me, talking in hushed voices until the sky lightened to gray. He left before sunrise, slipping out like a ghost. But this time, my phone buzzed immediately. "However this ends, meeting you was the best thing that ever happened to me." The next week at work was torture. Sarah watched us with renewed interest, her gaze sharp every time we interacted. We dialed back even our professional contact, communicating through emails even when we sat 10 feet apart. The distance felt physical, like someone had yanked a cord tight between us. Thursday came, but neither of us mentioned the cafe. At 6:45 p.m. my phone lit up. Parking garage. Now. My hand shook as I gathered my things. The elevator ride down felt endless, every second stretching taut with possibility. He waited by his car, shoulders tense. When he saw me, something in his expression cracked open. Without a word, he pulled me into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind us. In that confined space, with the garage's fluorescent lights flickering overhead, all our careful rules evaporated. His mouth found mine, his hands mapping familiar territory like he was memorizing me. Afterward, we lay tangled together, the leather seats sticking to our skin. He traced idle patterns on my shoulder. "We can't keep doing this," he murmured, but his arms tightened around me. I knew he was right, knew this couldn't end well. But when he kissed me again, slow and deep, all my resolve melted. The risk, the consequences, the inevitable fallout, none of it mattered in that moment. That moment stretched into weeks, then months. The intense highs of stolen encounters gave way to a constant low-grade hum of anxiety. Summer bled into autumn, the rain outside the cafe window becoming a familiar backdrop to our hushed conversations. We perfected the art of near misses and coded language, existing in a fragile bubble built on borrowed time and whispered promises. The tightrope felt thinner, the balancing act more precarious with each passing day. The weight of what we stood to lose, pressing down on us both. The promotion offer came 6 months later, a bigger office, more money, a city 3 time zones away. He turned it down without discussion. I only found out when HR mentioned it in passing. That night at the cafe, I confronted him. "Why would you do that?" He stirred his coffee slowly before answering. "I couldn't leave you. Not yet." The words hung between us, heavy with unspoken futures. We maintain appearances at work, but after hours, when the office empties, he leans against my desk, the space between us a shifting line. His gaze meets mine, and in that look, hope and regret remain tangled, unresolved.